1 hour to leave or you are going to jail. You are standing right next to the artificial lake you built with your own hands. On land you legally owned long before this HOA even existed. And bam, an HOA tyrant named Margaret shows up with the police, points straight at your face, and screams that you are trespassing on your own property. She made up a bunch of rules that do not exist in any bylaws, then demanded you pay $4,500 if you do not comply. But what if you are holding evidence that could bring down the entire board? Do not look away. This battle is crazier than a Category 5 hurricane hitting in the middle of summer. Comment below. Where are you watching from? The morning sun hit the water at exactly 7:15 a.m., turning my artificial lake into a mirror of gold and amber. I stood on the wooden dock, coffee in hand, watching koi fish drift beneath the surface like living brushstrokes. This was my sanctuary. 2.3 acres I had purchased in 2018, 3 years before Willow Creek Estates HOA even existed. The lake itself took 8 months to design and construct, and when the county inspector signed off on permit number WC 2019-0234, he told me it was one of the finest private water features he had ever approved. That permit, along with my deed of trust and every construction document, sat in a fireproof safe inside my home office. The legal timeline was simple. I built this in 2019. The HOA was incorporated in 2021. My property predated their jurisdiction by 2 full years. 22 years as a geological engineer had shaped me into someone who documents everything and trusts nothing without verification. That career taught me how to read contracts, navigate bureaucracies, and recognize when someone was attempting to manufacture authority they did not possess. People like me do not fold under pressure. We prepare for it. For 3 peaceful years after the HOA formation, we coexisted without incident. I assumed the boundaries were understood. Then the envelope arrived at 9:47 a.m., tucked between a utility bill and a furniture catalog. The Willow Creek Estates letterhead glared at me with its pretentious cursive font, and inside was a single sheet bearing the header, Notice of Violation number 2024-0847. The letter claimed my water feature did not comply with community landscape standards, citing Section 4.7 of their community guidelines. It demanded I submit a retroactive application within 14 days or face daily fines of $150. I pulled up the actual CC&Rs on my laptop and found the truth within minutes. Section 4.7 referenced exterior paint colors and fence heights. Nothing about ponds, nothing about lakes, nothing about any body of water whatsoever. Someone had invented this rule from thin air, betting I would not bother to verify. That afternoon, the situation escalated from bureaucratic nuisance to something more unsettling. A silver sedan sat parked on the public road adjacent to my property, positioned with a direct line of sight to the lake. Behind the wheel was Margaret Thornton, the HOA president herself, holding her phone aimed squarely at my land. She was photographing my property, documenting something, building some kind of case. When I raised my hand in a questioning gesture, she drove away without a word. No wave, no acknowledgement, just a cold, deliberate departure. The interaction lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it left a residue of unease that settled into my bones. This was not random. This was surveillance. My neighbor Greg Donovan walked past that evening while I was checking my mailbox. I mentioned Margaret's strange behavior, expecting him to dismiss it as typical HOA overreach. Instead, his response made my stomach tighten. He said Margaret had approached him last week, asking whether I had any plans to sell my place, that she seemed oddly interested in my property specifically, and kept pressing about whether I might be open to offers. Greg had thought nothing of it at the time, just chalked it up to nosiness, but now we both stood there processing the implications. Why would the HOA president care whether I planned to sell? What possible business was that of hers? I thanked Greg and went inside, but his words followed me through the front door and into my office. I spent the next 3 hours combing through public records, searching for anything that might explain Margaret's sudden interest in my land. The answer appeared on the County Planning Department website, buried in a list of pending development applications. Thornton Development, LLC had submitted plans for a mixed-use project on the parcel directly adjacent to my property, commercial retail on the ground floor, residential units above, with an estimated value exceeding $12 million. The application was pending environmental review, awaiting approval from multiple county departments. I scrolled to the company details and found the registered agent listed as Raymond Thornton. The last name was not a coincidence. A quick search confirmed my suspicion. Raymond Thornton was Margaret's brother, and his company needed something from the land next to mine. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, connecting the dots that had seemed random just hours ago. The fabricated violation, the surveillance from the road, the questions about selling. Margaret was not enforcing HOA rules. She was running interference for her brother's development project, pressuring me through official channels while pretending it was all about community standards. The lake was not the problem. I was the problem. An obstacle standing between Thornton Development and whatever they needed from this side of the property line. I did not yet understand exactly what they wanted or how my land fit into their plans, but I understood enough. This fight had nothing to do with landscape guidelines. This was about money, about pressure, about making me uncomfortable enough to walk away. I walked back outside and stood on the dock as the last light faded from the sky. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the first evening stars like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine started, headlights sweeping across the road before disappearing toward town. I wondered if it was Margaret, circling back for more photographs. It did not matter. I had documents she did not know I possessed, records that proved my ownership beyond dispute. When someone comes at you with fabricated authority, you do not retreat. You prepare. They came without warning at 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. 3 figures walking up my driveway like they owned the place. Margaret Thornton led the group with rigid authority, flanked by 2 men from the HOA board. Harold, a retired accountant, clutched a measuring tape. Stephen, a younger man who always seemed uncomfortable around Margaret, hung back slightly. I watched them approach from my kitchen window, my coffee growing cold. The clipboard in Margaret's hand told me everything about their intentions. This was not a social visit. I met them at the front door before they could ring the bell. Margaret announced that the Architectural Review Committee was conducting a mandatory inspection of my water feature, citing multiple complaints about safety hazards and aesthetic violations. I asked who filed these complaints. Confidential, she said. I asked what specific violations they were investigating. She produced a typed list and read it with theatrical gravity. My lake exceeded the maximum allowable depth of 3 feet. The water displayed an unnatural blue-green shade, indicating improper chemical treatment. I was housing fish without an HOA aquaculture permit. 3 accusations, each more absurd than the last, each completely fabricated. I waited until she finished, then asked one simple question. Where exactly in the CC&Rs were these requirements written? Her expression flickered before she recovered. These were standard guidelines established by the Board for Community Safety and Property Values, she explained. I pulled out my phone and opened the CC&Rs PDF, scrolling to Article 5, Section 2. Any new rule affecting property use required a 2/3 vote of all homeowners, with 30 days written notice before implementation. No such vote had occurred. No such notice had been sent. I then directed her to Article 4, Section 7, which mandated 72 hours written notice before any property inspection. I had received nothing. Therefore, this inspection would not happen today. Harold shifted uncomfortably. Stephen stared at the ground. Margaret's face reddened as she launched into a barrage of consequences. Accumulated fines, legal action, damage to my community standing, obstruction of legitimate authority, all delivered in one breathless tirade designed to overwhelm rather than inform. I remained on my doorstep, hands in my pockets, voice level. I told her I welcomed any official documentation, as long as it accurately reflected that I had insisted on following the very rules she claimed to enforce. The standoff lasted another minute before Margaret turned and marched down the driveway, her entourage trailing behind. Stephen glanced back once, And in that brief look I saw not hostility, but something closer to apology, maybe even warning. Then they were gone, their car disappearing around the corner while I stood processing what had just happened. That evening, Greg Donovan texted asking if we could talk. I found him on his back porch with 2 beers already opened. He said he had seen the HOA delegation that morning and wanted to share something his wife had learned. She worked at the county planning office, and over dinner she mentioned that Thornton Development's application for the adjacent property had hit a major obstacle. The environmental review required proof of sustainable water access for the proposed commercial development. The nearest viable source was my artificial lake. Without it, the project would require drilling new wells at prohibitive cost, making the entire development financially unfeasible. Greg paused to let that sink in. Margaret's brother needed my water, and Margaret was manufacturing problems to pressure me into selling. Everything crystallized in that moment. The fabricated violations, the surprise inspection, the surveillance from the road. Margaret was not protecting community standards. She was weaponizing the HOA to serve her brother's business interests, creating enough harassment to make selling seem easier than fighting. The lake was never about aesthetics or safety. It was about $12 million worth of development that could not proceed without access to my property. I thanked Greg and walked home through the gathering darkness. My perspective fundamentally altered. This was no longer a dispute about homeowner association overreach. This was a coordinated campaign of pressure using manufactured authority, and I had been treating it far too casually. I spent the rest of the evening building my case. First, a formal written response to the violation notice, citing every section of the CC&Rs that Margaret had ignored or misrepresented. Second, a timeline document recording every interaction since that first letter arrived, every claimed violation, every piece of information Greg had shared, every instance of surveillance I had observed. I photographed every document in my fireproof safe and uploaded copies to secure cloud storage. If Margaret wanted to play the documentation game, she would find me exceptionally prepared. My career had trained me to build cases from scattered evidence, to identify patterns in seemingly random data, to anticipate how opponents would move before they moved. Those skills were about to find a new application. The lake sat dark and still outside my office window as I worked past midnight, its surface reflecting nothing but stars. I thought about the koi fish drifting somewhere beneath that black water, oblivious to the battle being waged over their home. Margaret had made a critical error in her calculations. She had assumed I would react like a typical homeowner, confused by jargon, intimidated by official letterhead, eager to make problems disappear through compliance or capitulation. She did not understand that every baseless demand she issued only strengthened my resolve. Every invented rule she cited gave me another piece of evidence for the pattern of abuse I was documenting. Every threat she made pushed me further from any possibility of settlement. I closed my laptop at 1:30 a.m., satisfied with the foundation I had built. Tomorrow, I will research real estate attorneys who specialize in HOA disputes. I would file public records requests for every document related to Thornton Development's pending application. I would reach out to other homeowners who might have experienced similar treatment. Margaret had started this fight believing she held all the power. She was about to discover that power based on fabrication crumbles when confronted with documented truth. The HOA had rules, and I intended to ensure those rules applied to everyone equally, including the president, who thought herself above them. The notice of lien arrived by certified mail on a Friday afternoon, timed perfectly to ensure I could not reach any government office or attorney until Monday. Heavy stock paper, embossed Willow Creek Estates letterhead. Margaret Thornton's aggressive signature sprawled across the bottom. According to the document, I had accumulated $4,500 in unpaid fines and legal fees related to ongoing violations. The HOA was placing a lien on my property, which would attach to the title and prevent any sale or refinancing until satisfied. I set it on my kitchen counter and felt the escalation settle into my chest like a stone. This was no longer about fake rules or failed inspections. This was an attack on my financial standing, I spent the weekend researching HOA lien procedures under state law. Article 6. Section 3 of our own bylaws was unambiguous. Any lien required written approval from at least 2/3 of the board members, with individual signatures documented in official meeting minutes. The notice I received contained only Margaret's signature. I checked the publicly posted minutes from the past 6 months. No vote on any lien against my property appeared anywhere. Either the vote never occurred, or someone had deliberately omitted it from the records. Either way, the lien was procedurally invalid. I photographed everything, added it to my evidence file, and drafted a formal dispute letter citing the specific violations of our own governing documents. Monday evening brought the monthly HOA meeting at the community center. Perhaps 40 residents filled the room, most of whom I recognized only vaguely from neighborhood walks. Margaret presided from a table at the front, flanked by Harold and 2 other board members. Stephen was notably absent when the new business began. Margaret stood and addressed the room with practiced concern. She explained that troubling reports had surfaced about a safety hazard in our community, specifically an unsecured artificial lake posing a drowning risk to children. She did not name me directly, but every eye turned toward where I sat in the 3rd row. The public attack was unmistakable. I raised my hand and waited until she acknowledged me with visible reluctance. Standing, I informed the room that my lake featured a 6-foot fence with a locked gate, posted warning signs at every access point, and a county inspection certificate confirming compliance with Code Section 3109.4. I asked Margaret what specific deficiency she was referring to and whether she had personally verified her claims. She stammered about complaints and investigation obligations. I asked who filed these complaints and when the board planned to follow proper notice procedures. She changed subjects without answering. The residents around me exchanged glances, and I saw doubt creeping into faces that had previously accepted Margaret's authority without question. After the meeting, a woman approached me in the parking lot. She introduced herself as Carol, a 12-year resident, and said she had watched Margaret's tactics destroy 2 previous homeowners. One fought for 18 months, the other barely 6. Both eventually sold out of sheer exhaustion, and both sold to the same buyer, a development company Carol suspected was connected to someone on the board. She could not remember the company's name, but the pattern was clear. Margaret had done this before. I was not her first target, and unless someone stopped her, I would not be her last. Carol wished me luck and walked away, leaving me with confirmation that my situation was not isolated, but systematic. I returned home and dove deeper into public records than ever before. The county assessor showed my property, valued at $890,000, significantly increased since completing the lake. The adjacent vacant parcel was valued at only $300,000, but zoned for mixed-use development. I pulled Thornton Development's full permit application and found what I needed in the environmental impact section. The proposed project required sustainable water access for landscaping, fire suppression, and aesthetic features. The application specifically mentioned establishing water-sharing agreements with adjacent property owners. My lake was not just convenient for Raymond Thornton's $12 million development. It was essential to the project's viability, and without it, the entire plan would collapse under the cost of alternative water infrastructure. The conspiracy crystallized with brutal clarity. Margaret was making threats and financial threats to force me into selling or granting water rights to her brother's company. The lien was not about recovering legitimate fines. It was about making my property unsellable until I cooperated. The public accusations at the HOA meeting were designed to isolate me from neighbors who might otherwise support my resistance. Every move was calculated, and every calculation pointed toward the same objective: get Colin Hartley off his land, or at a minimum, get access to his water. I opened my case file and reviewed what I had assembled. The original violation notice cited non-existent rules, documentation of the failed inspection attempt. The procedurally invalid lien lacks the required board signatures. Margaret's surveillance from the public road. Greg's information about the development project's water requirements. Carol's testimony about previous homeowners pressured into selling. The permit application explicitly states the need for adjacent water access. Individually, each piece might seem like circumstantial evidence or bureaucratic incompetence. Together, they formed a pattern of coordinated abuse that any reasonable observer would recognize as fraudulent. I created a backup of every file and uploaded it to secure cloud storage. Then I began researching attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes and property rights litigation. Margaret believed she was tightening a noose, but her overconfidence had left a paper trail wide enough to drive a truck through. The invalid lien alone could expose the board to significant legal liability. Combined with evidence of the family connection to Thornton Development and the pattern of targeting homeowners for acquisition, I was building a case that went far beyond simple procedural violations. This was fraud disguised as community governance. The lake sat silent outside my window as I worked past midnight, its surface black and still under a clouded sky. Margaret had chosen her target poorly. She saw a retiree living alone, assumed I would fold under pressure like her previous victims. She did not know I had spent 2 decades navigating complex disputes with incomplete information and hostile opponents. She did not understand that every threat she issued only hardened my resolve. The shadow behind the HOA had revealed itself, and I was preparing to drag it into the light where everyone could see exactly what it was. I was standing on my dock at 8:45 a.m. when 3 vehicles pulled up to my property line in quick succession. Margaret emerged from the first car, followed by Harold and a man in a security uniform. The second vehicle held 2 more board members. The third was a county sheriff's cruiser, the deputy inside waiting with his window down. I had anticipated something like this since the HOA meeting, so I reached into my pocket and pressed record on my phone before walking toward the gate. Whatever happened next would be documented. Margaret planted herself at the edge of my property, careful not to step onto my land, and announced loud enough for the deputy to hear that she was addressing a serious matter of community safety. The lake behind me, she declared, was located on HOA common area land and had been illegally constructed without board approval. She was giving me one opportunity to vacate voluntarily before involving law enforcement. I asked her to produce documentation proving encroachment. She claimed the board's attorney was preparing it. I told her that, until actual evidence existed, I would not be vacating anything. The standoff had begun. The deputy stepped out of his cruiser and approached the gate. He introduced himself as Officer Kevin Walsh and asked both parties to explain calmly. Margaret launched into her narrative, describing me as a hostile resident who had constructed an illegal water feature on community land, adding that she felt threatened by my defiance. When she finished, I handed Officer Walsh the folder I had prepared, certified copies of my deed of trust, my property survey with exact boundary lines, and my construction permit, signed by the county. He examined them carefully while Margaret grew visibly agitated. After several minutes, he looked up and addressed her directly. According to these documents, the lake fell entirely within my private property. The fence matched the survey exactly. He saw no evidence of trespassing or encroachment. Margaret's face reddened as she insisted the documents were outdated or falsified. Officer Walsh asked to see her survey. She admitted she did not have it. He suggested she obtain proper documentation before making further accusations, then confirmed I was within my rights to remain on my own property. The official validation of everything I had been saying for weeks landed like a verdict, and Margaret could not accept it. What happened next became the centerpiece of my eventual case. She lost control completely, stepping forward and pointing her finger at my face. She shouted that I was destroying property values, that my stubbornness was costing the community millions, that if I would just sell to the right buyer, all of this would end immediately. The words hung in the air like a signed confession. Officer Walsh's expression shifted as he registered the implication. I asked calmly who exactly the right buyer would be. She caught herself mid-breath, suddenly aware of what she had revealed. She stammered about any reasonable buyer, someone who would maintain standards, but the damage was done. Her own words had exposed the true purpose behind months of harassment. Officer Walsh stepped between us and addressed Margaret firmly. This was the 3rd call his department had received about this address in the past month. all originating from her. Continued misuse of emergency services could result in citations or criminal charges for filing false reports. He advised her to consult an attorney if she believed she had a valid property dispute, because legitimate concerns were addressed through civil courts, not by calling 911 against a man standing on his own property. Then he returned to his cruiser and drove away, leaving Margaret standing frozen at my gate. Harold would not meet my eyes. The security guard looked desperate to disappear. Margaret turned and walked to her car without another word, her posture rigid with humiliation. The vehicles departed one by one, leaving me alone with the morning sun warming my back and the recording still running in my pocket. Her admission about the right buyer, Officer Walsh's warning about false reports, the complete collapse of her manufactured narrative, all preserved as evidence. I walked back to my dock and stopped the recording, then played it back to confirm every word was captured clearly. Margaret had not simply slipped up. She had revealed the entire strategy in a moment of unguarded fury. The violations, the lien, the police calls, all designed to pressure me into selling to someone connected to her brother's development project. I had suspected this for weeks. Now I had her own voice confirming it. The shift from defense to offense happened in that moment. Standing on the dock with her confession saved to my phone. That afternoon, I made 2 calls that would change the trajectory of this fight. The first was to William Crawford, a real estate attorney Greg had recommended who specialized in HOA disputes and property rights litigation. I gave him a 30-minute summary of everything that had occurred, and he agreed to meet the following day after reviewing the documents I would send. The second call was to the County Property Rights Office, where I filed an official complaint regarding the invalid lien and requested a formal investigation into the HOA's procedural violations. The clerk informed me that complaints involving potential fraud were referred to the district attorney's office for review. I provided my contact information and promised to submit supporting documentation by the end of business. I spent the evening organizing my evidence into a coherent package. The original violation notice cited fabricated rules. The notice of lien is lacking the required board signatures. Screenshots of HOA meeting minutes with no record of any vote on my property. The permit application from Thornton Development shows the project's dependence on adjacent water access. Carol's account of previous homeowners being pressured into selling. And now, the recording of Margaret explicitly connecting my sale to the resolution of all conflicts, each piece connected to the next, forming a chain of evidence that pointed unmistakably toward coordinated fraud. I emailed everything to Attorney Crawford and CC'd myself on a backup account. The next phase would require professional guidance, but the foundation was solid. Margaret had spent months building a case against me, using manufactured authority and fabricated violations. In one unguarded moment of rage, she had given me everything I needed to tear that case apart and expose the corruption at its core. Tomorrow I will meet with Crawford and begin constructing the legal framework for my counterattack. The HOA wanted a fight. They were about to discover what happened when their target fought back with evidence instead of emotion. Attorney William Crawford's office occupied the 3rd floor of a modest building downtown, walls lined with framed certificates and photographs of satisfied clients. He was a carte-packed man in his early 50s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for dismantling HOA overreach cases with surgical precision. When I arrived at 9 a.m., he had already spread my documents across his conference table, like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. "Mr. Hartley," he said without preamble, "I have practiced property law for 23 years. Someone handed you a gift-wrapped lawsuit." He played the recording of Margaret's outburst twice, transcribing her exact words about selling to the right buyer, combined with the invalid lien and fabricated violations. We had grounds for multiple causes of action. He outlined them efficiently. Abuse of process for weaponizing HOA procedures, harassment through repeated false police reports, tortious interference with property rights, potentially fraud, depending on what we could prove about the Thornton development connection. The strategy was straightforward. File a formal complaint with the County Property Rights Office. Send a demand letter requiring lien removal and cessation of harassment within 14 days. If they refused, file a civil lawsuit seeking $75,000 in damages. Crawford estimated resolution within weeks if they settled. 6 to 9 months if they fought. I left his office feeling something I had not experienced since this ordeal began. Control. For months, I had been reacting to attacks, defending against fabricated accusations. Now the dynamic was shifting. I was building an offensive that would expose everything Margaret had done. That evening, Greg Donovan knocked on my door, looking troubled, almost guilty. He asked if we could talk privately, then sat on my back porch in silence for a long moment, before sliding his phone across the table. He explained he had been copied on an email chain between Margaret and board members 6 months ago, before any of this started. At the time, he had not understood its significance. After watching what happened to me, he could no longer stay silent. The email thread contained 7 messages spanning 2 weeks. Subject line read, Hartley Property Strategy. Margaret outlined a plan to create compliance pressure through escalating violations and fines, making continued ownership financially and emotionally untenable. The 4th message contained the sentence that would destroy her. She wrote that Raymond would compensate each participating board member with a finder's fee of $5,000 once the acquisition was complete, paid through consulting agreements to avoid direct paper trails. The final message, sent 2 days before my first violation notice, confirmed all recipients were on board. I read it 3 times to absorb the full weight. This was not circumstantial evidence. This was a documented conspiracy to defraud me of my property, with explicit mention of financial kickbacks. Margaret had put her scheme in writing, confident her allies would never betray her. Greg explained that Stephen had forwarded the chain accidentally while trying to send something else, then panicked and asked him to delete it. Greg had kept it instead. Now he was certain this needed to come out. I asked if he would provide this evidence formally. Understanding it would make him a witness in legal proceedings. He nodded without hesitation. He was tired of watching Margaret bully this community for 3 years while everyone pretended it was not happening. 2 other board members, Susan and Douglas, had already confided in him that they never voted for the lien against my property. Margaret had simply announced it was approved without following the procedure. Both were willing to provide sworn statements confirming the vote never occurred. I forwarded everything to Crawford that night. His response arrived within an hour. "This changes everything," he wrote. "We now have direct evidence of conspiracy, bribery of fiduciary officials, and fraud. I am upgrading our filing and coordinating with the district attorney's office regarding a potential criminal referral." The next morning, I filed the civil lawsuit at the county courthouse. Case number CV 2024-1847 was officially opened, naming Margaret Thornton individually and Willow Creek Estates HOA as defendants. The causes of action now included conspiracy to defraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and civil RICO violations for the pattern of corrupt activity. Crawford had also sent the evidence package to the district attorney with a formal request for criminal investigation into the bribery scheme. The machinery of justice was finally in motion. But Margaret did not yet know how thoroughly her defenses had collapsed. According to Greg, she was still operating as if the email chain had remained secret, still believing her board allies would protect her. She had scheduled a special HOA meeting for the following week to discuss further action against my property, apparently planning to double down on her campaign. The timing could not have been better. Crawford suggested we allow the meeting to proceed, giving Margaret one final opportunity to incriminate herself publicly before we revealed the full scope of our evidence. I spent the next several days preparing for what Crawford called the exposure phase. We drafted a formal presentation documenting every violation of HOA procedures, every fabricated rule, every instance of Margaret's abuse of authority. The email chain would be introduced last, as the culmination of a pattern that jurors and community members alike would find impossible to ignore. Crawford also reached out to Carol, the woman who had approached me after the first HOA meeting, and confirmed she was willing to testify about the 2 previous homeowners who had been pressured into selling. Their properties had indeed been purchased by shell companies that traced back to Thornton development. The pattern was now documented across multiple victims spanning several years. Greg provided one additional piece of information that strengthened our case further. He had obtained copies of the official HOA meeting, minutes from the past year, and cross-referenced them against the actions Margaret had claimed were board-approved. The discrepancies were staggering. 17 separate actions attributed to board votes had no corresponding record in the minutes. Either Margaret was fabricating approvals, or the minutes were being deliberately falsified to hide what the board actually discussed. Either way, the documentation revealed systematic fraud at the highest level of community governance. Crawford filed a motion to preserve all HOA records, preventing any destruction of evidence before trial. He also subpoenaed bank records from the HOA operating account, searching for any payments that might correspond to the kickback scheme described in Margaret's emails. The net was closing around her from multiple directions simultaneously. Every attempt she had made to pressure me into selling had created another thread of evidence, another witness willing to testify, another paper trail leading back to her brother's development project. I stood by my window that evening, watching the last light fade across the lake. The water that Margaret had tried to take from me reflected colors she would never control. Tomorrow, the HOA would hold its special meeting, and Margaret would walk into a trap she had built entirely by herself. The counterattack was no longer a preparation. It was execution. The community center was filled by 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the special meeting was scheduled to begin. Word had spread that something significant was happening, and residents who had skipped meetings for years suddenly found the time. I arrived with Attorney Crawford and took seats near the front where Margaret could see us clearly. Her expression shifted from confidence to wariness the moment she noticed legal counsel at my side. A woman with a county identification badge sat in the back corner, taking notes. Crawford had informed me that the Property Rights Office would send an observer following our complaint. Margaret noticed her too, and wariness became something closer to fear. Margaret called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. and launched into her prepared agenda about ongoing compliance issues requiring stronger enforcement. Before she could continue, Crawford stood and introduced himself as my legal representative with a formal presentation relevant to the matters being discussed. Margaret objected, claiming the meeting followed a set agenda. Residents throughout the room called out that they wanted to hear what he had to say. A quick vote was taken, 47 in favor, 3 opposed. Margaret yielded the floor, her face flushed with barely contained fury. Crawford connected his laptop to the projector and moved through the evidence efficiently. He established my property ownership and permit validity in one slide, then displayed the CC&Rs proving the cited rules did not exist. The third slide showed the notice of lien beside Article 6. Section 3, demonstrating the required board vote had never occurred. Susan and Douglas stood when Crawford mentioned their names and confirmed publicly that they had never voted on any lien. The murmurs grew louder. Crawford then displayed the Thornton development connection, Raymond's name as registered agent, and the permit application mentioning water access from adjacent properties. Residents began connecting dots they had never seen before. The final slide showed Margaret's email with the incriminating sentences highlighted. Crawford read the key passage aloud. Raymond would compensate each participating board member with $5,000 once the acquisition was complete. The room erupted. People shouted questions and turned to stare at Margaret, with expressions ranging from disbelief to fury. She stood abruptly, shouting that the emails were fabricated, that I had manufactured evidence to destroy her reputation, but her voice cracked under desperation. Harold would not look at her. The other board members stared at the table. No one came to her defense. Carol stood near the back and said she had something to add. Margaret had sent her identical violation notices about her fence 3 years ago, citing rules that did not exist. After months of harassment, Thornton Development offered to buy her property at below market value. Another hand went up. A man named Frank said the same thing happened to him over a garden shed 2 years ago. A third resident named Paula described pressure over her driveway extension. The pattern was undeniable. Margaret had been running this scheme for years, targeting homeowners until they sold or fought back hard enough to make her move on. The county observer stood and identified herself as Patricia Wells from the Property Rights Office, based on what she had witnessed. Her office would open a formal investigation into potential fraud and abuse of fiduciary duty. She advised all residents to preserve documentation related to violations, fines, or board communications. Margaret tried to claim the county had no jurisdiction over internal HOA matters. Patricia cut her off. "When fraud is alleged and documented," she said, "jurisdiction becomes very clear." The room fell silent as the weight of official intervention settled over everyone present. Margaret grabbed her purse and pushed toward the exit. Residents blocked her path, demanding answers. How many families had she targeted? How much had her brother promised? She shoved through without responding, her composure shattered beyond repair. Harold followed moments later, head down, ignoring questions shouted in his direction. The board table sat empty except for Susan and Douglas, who remained to answer questions from neighbors crowding around them. The power structure that had governed Willow Creek Estates for years had collapsed in less than an hour. Crawford addressed the remaining residents, explaining that a civil lawsuit, Case CV 2024-1847, had been filed, with a criminal referral under consideration. He encouraged anyone with similar experiences to contact his office. By the time the meeting adjourned, 17 additional residents had provided contact information. The community that had accepted Margaret's authority without question was now unified in demanding accountability. 3 of them mentioned they had documentation of their own experiences that they had been too intimidated to share until tonight. I walked out into the cool evening air with Crawford reviewing his notes beside me. The exposure phase was complete. Margaret's scheme had been laid bare before witnesses, documented by county officials, and corroborated by multiple victims spanning years of abuse. The evidence trail was no longer just my case, but a pattern of systematic fraud that would be impossible to dismiss or minimize. Patricia Wells approached us in the parking lot and handed Crawford her card. She said the Property Rights Office would coordinate with the District Attorney's Office, given the scope of what had been presented. Criminal charges were likely, she added, particularly regarding the bribery scheme outlined in the emails. She thanked us for bringing the matter forward and walked to her car. Crawford turned to me with the closest thing to satisfaction I had seen on his professional face. He said we had achieved more in one evening than most HOA disputes accomplished in a year of litigation. The public exposure meant Margaret could no longer control the narrative. Witnesses were coming forward. Officials were investigating. Her brother's development project was now publicly linked to fraud. The dominoes would continue falling without any additional effort on our part. I drove home through quiet streets, passing houses where neighbors had just witnessed the unraveling of years of corruption. Some of them had been victims themselves. Others had simply looked away while Margaret accumulated power. Tonight, they had seen what happened when one person refused to be intimidated, when documentation met determination, when the truth reached an audience that could not ignore it. The lake would still be there tomorrow, unchanged by everything that had happened, but Willow Creek Estates would never be the same. 2 months after the community meeting, the legal consequences arrived with the precision of a court calendar. I sat in Crawford's office as he walked me through the final documents, each one representing a piece of accountability I had fought months to achieve. The civil case had resolved faster than either of us anticipated. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of criminal referral, the HOA's insurance carrier had pushed for immediate settlement rather than risk a jury trial that would only deepen their exposure. Margaret Thornton was removed from her position as HOA president by a vote of 89% of homeowners, the largest margin in Willow Creek Estates history. The community that had once accepted her authority without question had turned decisively against her once the truth emerged. Beyond removal, she faced personal liability under California Civil Code Section 5975 for abuse of HOA authority. The court ordered her to pay $12,500 in statutory penalties, with an additional $47,000 in damages awarded directly to me for legal fees. financial harm, and emotional distress caused by her campaign of harassment. A 5-year ban prohibited her from holding any position on an HOA board anywhere in the state. The notice of lien that had threatened my property was formally dismissed on March 15, 2025. Crawford handed me the certified copy of the order of dismissal, the court seal embossed in the corner like a stamp of vindication. The document represented more than just the removal of a fraudulent claim. It represented the complete collapse of everything Margaret had built against me. Every fabricated violation, every procedural abuse, every attempt to manufacture authority had been exposed and rejected by the legal system she had tried to weaponize. Raymond Thornton fared no better. The county denied his development permit following the public revelation of the scheme to acquire adjacent properties through fraud. His company, Thornton Development, LLC, was now under investigation by the district attorney's office for attempted fraud and conspiracy. The $12 million project that had motivated Margaret's entire campaign would never be built. The water access he had needed from my lake would remain exactly where it belonged, on my private property, under my exclusive control. Harold resigned from the board before charges could be filed against him, apparently hoping that voluntary departure would spare him from prosecution. The other board members who had participated in Margaret's scheme faced individual scrutiny, with Susan and Douglas's testimony providing clear evidence of who had known what and when. The community was electing an entirely new board, with Greg Donovan reluctantly agreeing to serve as interim president until proper elections could be organized. Willow Creek Estates was rebuilding itself from the ground up. I received a letter from Carol thanking me for fighting, when she had been too exhausted to continue years ago. Frank sent a similar message, as did Paula and 3 other former residents who had sold their properties under pressure from Margaret's manufactured violations. They could not recover what they had lost, but they took satisfaction in knowing that the person responsible had finally been held accountable. Their experiences would be included in the ongoing criminal investigation, potentially adding additional charges to Margaret's growing legal troubles. The evening after I received the final settlement documents, I walked down to the dock with the order of dismissal in my hand. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the sunset in shades of gold and amber that reminded me of the morning this had all begun. I thought about everything that had happened since that first violation notice arrived. The escalating threats, the failed inspection, the police calls, the public accusations, the moment Margaret had revealed her true intentions in a flash of uncontrolled anger. Every step of her campaign had been designed to break me. Instead, each attack had only strengthened my resolve and added to the evidence that ultimately destroyed her. I folded the order of dismissal carefully, creasing the paper into the shape of a small boat. The childhood skill came back automatically. Muscle memory from decades ago, when my father had taught me to make paper vessels on lazy summer afternoons. I set the boat gently on the water and watched it drift away from the dock, carried by a breeze so slight I could barely feel it on my face. The paper caught the last light of the sun as it floated toward the center of the lake, a symbol of everything I had reclaimed through patience, documentation, and the refusal to surrender what was rightfully mine. Greg appeared at the edge of my property, walking his dog along the path that bordered my fence. He paused and looked out at the water, then raised his hand in greeting. "Nice lake you have there, Colin," he called out. I smiled and watched the paper boat complete its slow journey across the still surface. "It is," I replied. "It always was." Margaret thought she could bully a quiet man into giving up his home. She manufactured rules, filed fake liens, and called the police on someone standing on his own property. She forgot one thing: some people fight back with evidence. If you love watching entitled neighbors face real consequences, subscribe to Karma Neighbors and hit that notification bell. Justice always finds a way.